Well, today is a dubious anniversary. 4 years ago today, Fauci held his secret teleconference that was organized by Jeremy Farrar, where the natural origin narrative was established, leading to the publication of proximal origin, bringing us to where we are today. And this is something that you and I have been looking at forever. As a matter of fact, I think we were probably the first ones to publicly write about that secret teleconference when you and I found it in those papers, in those emails. We've gotten some new information, a little bit of this that we disclosed last week, and that new information related to the fact that the FBI was told at the very onset of the COVID outbreak that it was almost certainly a lab leak. They were told this by a very high-placed whistleblower that they felt comfortable with, that somebody that may actually have been at the lab itself, the Wuhan lab. We're not sure of that, but it was more than credible enough that they established a task force, which is another piece of information we didn't know about. And this task force was actually looking directly at EcoHealth as being the source and the originator of the leak at the Wuhan lab. Which is pretty big news. And that got us going back and deciding to revisit the entire timeline. And specifically, I actually created a whole new timeline where I was trying to look at in depth the first 4 months of the outbreak. And what really came to light for me, I'd always been, I think we'd always been aware of it, but seeing it this stark is that there was this ongoing battle behind the scenes between Fauci, aligned with the intelligence community and some members of Trump's administration against Trump, and really just a couple people, primarily Peter Navarro. And there was this ongoing battle behind the scenes that was raging for about 4 months with these two different camps fighting with each other. And Fauci trying to undermine Trump at every single step. It was really something to see in paper. I know you've seen a little bit of that yourself. What do you think?
Yeah, well, that timeline is extraordinarily important in terms of the cover-up. And when did Fauci, when did anyone in the U.S. government know about this virus? How much did they know? And when was the cover-up initiated? Now, I remember when those emails came out initially about the secret teleconference, of which we have the 4-year anniversary today, right? Those emails came out in 2021, about 18 months after the event, so about 2.5 years from today, like in the past. So for 2.5 years, we've known about the secret teleconference. Now, you and I, based on what was discussed there, assumed, and I think correctly assumed, that what triggered Fauci was an article on the previous day, January 31st, 2020, in Science magazine. And that article, there's a couple, the article is basically a puff piece for natural origin. Nothing to see here, this is all natural. But it had a link in there, a hyperlink, which you could click, which would take you to another article, and that article had another link which would take you to a very bad experiment that was done by Ralph Baric, who of course Fauci would have known who that was and what he was up to, and Shi Zhengli, the director of the Wuhan lab. So we always thought that that's what triggered Fauci to immediately do something about that in terms of the cover-up. Obviously, Jeremy Farrar, the head of the British Wellcome Trust, had his own reasons. For instance, one of his reasons was that he was basically all the way back to childhood or college, a friend of this Gao Fu guy, who is the head of the Chinese CDC. But I think, given what we've now kind of uncovered or gone back and looked at again, there was more knowledge and more malfeasance before that. So in other words, yes, the article in Science magazine did trigger the immediateness of the cover-up. Like, we need to do something right now because the article is out there and we need to just push back. Even though the article was a puff piece for natural origin.
Yeah, John Cohen just made a mistake in that article.
Yeah.
And it was a two-step mistake. Like you said, it was a link, and then you took that link, and then you had to find the next link. But that following link was gain-of-function experiments, and that undercut Fauci's narrative that there was no funding of gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab. because that 2015 piece directly proved that that's exactly what was going on.
And that the lab was making coronavirus, that they were engineering coronaviruses to be more infectious in humans, which,
Yeah.
of course, at the time would have been. This is before we knew about all these other smoking guns that have been released since. But at the time, all we knew is that there's an outbreak in Wuhan of a highly infectious coronavirus, which they're not normally, and Wuhan is 1,000 miles away from the nearest bat caves. So suddenly, there's an article that says that the people at that lab, with the help of U.S. Advanced Biotechnology and Ralph Baric in particular, and of course Fauci's funding, were making such dangerous viruses. So even if you knew nothing else at the time, other than the fact that it started in Wuhan and that they were creating these viruses in Wuhan with the help of Fauci, that would have been very, very, very bad, for Fauci in terms of what people would have concluded from that. So the pushback had to be immediate. But I think we've found other data points preceding that, which point to more complicity than that, and starting earlier. For instance, the sequence that was suppressed when it first came out of the virus.
Yeah, that's one of the things that leapt out at me. So we knew about this before, but it was a Chinese researcher, Chinese virologist, posted the sequence of COVID to the NIH database on December 28th. And what NIH did was very strange. They claimed that the sequence wasn't complete, and they sent an email back to Ren, who by then had been obviously silenced by Chinese authorities. And they said that they couldn't post it unless they got a response from her. And of course, they never got a response. So that sequence never made it onto their site. Now, just the other day, they had a Health and Human Services person that was testifying in front of Congress just yesterday and claiming, basically she clammed up. She wouldn't answer anything. Well, interestingly, it's the exact same person who sent a responsive letter explaining what the NIH did, and there's no explanation for it. It basically said, well, it didn't meet our guidelines. We didn't hear a response, so we deleted the sequence, which in of itself is very strange. But we now know that that sequence was perfectly fine. It was analyzed by a guy named Jesse Bloom, who's done a lot of fantastic work. And he found that that sequence was perfectly capable of making a vaccine from that data. Now, to make this a little bit more interesting, so you may be asking, like, well, why did NIH delete it? Well, what we do know is that Eddie Holmes is the guy who ultimately posted the sequence on January 11th, so about 2 weeks later. And it was published on NIH's GenBank site the following day. And right there, it's a little suspect because, this guy, Eddie Holmes, was part of the whole COVID cover-up, a co-author of Proximal Origin, a guy who told Fauci that it looks like the virus came out of a lab, but then later in Proximal Origin does just the opposite, claims it was a natural origin. He knew before that, he had access to that sequence on January 5th, but he withheld it because the Chinese government asked him to. And we know this because he slipped up and admitted this during a speech about a year later, of which you found a clip. And it's pretty damning. It's a little hard to find that clip these days, although we still have it. So, again, just to put this in line, December 28th, the sequence is posted by a Chinese researcher. We now know it's a valid sequence. NIH refuses to publish it. At the same time, Eddie Holmes, about a week later, gets his hand on the same sequence, but he doesn't post it because China doesn't want them to yet. China agrees to release it on December 11th. That's when it gets posted. 2 crucial weeks have gone by. I personally find it very questionable that NIH's suspension of the original sequence it gives China exactly the time that they were demanding of Eddie Holmes.
And when they did finally publish it on January 11th, their hand was forced by this guy in one of their labs who basically published it of his own volition, probably because he had a conscience and he knew.
Yeah.
We've had this here for 2-3 weeks or whatever. the longer we hold on to it, the longer it will take to do something about this virus, for people to understand this virus, to never mind so-called vaccines, even just some kind of therapeutics. I mean, you need the sequence. So this guy released it, and then immediately the guy's lab was shut down for so-called rectification. And, you feel sorry for whatever happened to this guy and his family. Which, by the way, I don't mean to digress for too long, but I find so many people, especially virologists, but just generally, do not understand China, just don't have a clue. They just assume this is like a normal country where a scientist can just publish stuff, or a guy at the lab could just publish the sequence without, very dire consequences for themselves and their families. And, people just don't get that. So good on that guy to have published it. Who knows how long they would have taken. Eddie wouldn't have published. Eddie would have just held on to it. By the way, later on, Eddie Holmes took credit for publishing it.
No, he took credit for it in real time. There's a tweet from Jeremy Farrar the very same day saying how great Eddie Holmes is for bringing this to the world's attention. And of course, Jeremy Farrar is the same guy that organized the secret teleconference of which Eddie Holmes was a part. We keep seeing the same little circle of people that over and over again.
It's like worse than stolen valor, because he was doing everything not to publish it. So it's not just that he took credit for what someone else did. He was actually working against that. By the way, something very similar happened a few weeks afterwards when Shi Zhengli, the director of the lab, had to admit that she had this RATG13 virus, which, by the way, they changed the name of the virus, presumably to hide the fact that they had it. So people, again, on the natural origin hoaxers, some people say, well, the fact that she said she had this virus, by the way, the reason why this virus is so important is because it's the closest known relative to the COVID-19 virus. So anyway, look, she eventually she told us about this virus. This is around the same time as the secret teleconference on February 1st, 2020. Well, no, she would have never told us about this virus. It was just that someone else had already put it out there, the fact that this other virus existed, towards the end of January. So a lot of distortions. But, coming back to Fauci's secret teleconference, it appears from the sequence that you were talking about there, that Fauci knew more, and it was just that the John Cohen Science article triggered the immediacy of the response. But leading up to that, he already knew more. So, for instance, another data point that has come up recently is this whole Moderna thing. So Fauci had an agreement with Moderna to do these vaccines and to mobilize, their words, not mine, right, on January 13th. So, of course, he knew more. He knew a lot more. Yeah. So this was at the same time he was telling everyone there wasn't a problem, but he was also in agreement with Moderna to mobilize towards these so-called vaccines.
And you're now heading in the direction exactly that I want to highlight. So again, with the backdrop that there was a sequence posted earlier and NIH literally deleted it. We have this delay, and ultimately we get the sequence on the 11th. There's a one-day delay before it makes it onto the NIH's GenBank site. That's the 12th when it's published. The following day, Fauci goes privately to Moderna and tells them, hey, we want you to go to, start doing whole-scale mobilization of these mRNA vaccines, which aren't even really vaccines. But that's the sequence in that 3-day span. It happens that quickly. But what's always bothered me, and it was highlighted by this weird deletion of the sequence, this delay from the NIH, is what Fauci was doing behind the scenes. So Fauci is going to Moderna and telling them, there's this urgency, start doing mass production. What's he doing publicly? At the same time, publicly, he's telling people that they don't need to wear masks, that they don't need to worry about COVID, that you need to worry far more about the flu than you need to worry about COVID itself. And this is where this battle that I alluded to at the outset was ongoing between he and Peter Navarro. Peter Navarro wrote a couple different internal memos, and he had a very different opinion than Fauci. He wrote an email on January 29th, which, by the way, just so happens to be the very same day that Fauci joins the COVID task force, the White House's task force on the coronavirus. And he's saying, hey, this is a big problem. We need to shut down all flights. We need to take this thing seriously. This is something different that we haven't seen before. Fauci fought him literally on shutting down flights to China. Now, Trump ultimately did it. He did it one day later on the 30th. But Fauci was against doing that. Fauci was against masks. Fauci was, telling people not to worry about things. These are all positions that Fauci later reversed and tried to pretend that he never did. So there's more examples of this, but it started to jump out at me, this manner in which, coupled with the deletion of the sequence, it almost appears like there was an intentional delay, or at least Fauci was trying to do that, whereas Navarro was pushing back hard. And, we can talk about this in a little bit, but there's a number of instances where Fauci appears to have undermined Navarro or tried to literally get him fired, this ongoing behind-the-scenes battle. But, you kind of remember that whole time frame, right, where there was this sort of back and forth and a weird public stance from Fauci.
You can't really reconcile these 2 points. So number one, you have the issue of the January 13th Moderna mobilization. That means there's a big problem. And we also have the video of the Moderna guy saying, by the way, before that day, which is a kind of a topic all in itself, that he was going to go from, his company was going to go from 100,000 doses of some kind of vaccine, not necessarily COVID, just 100, that was their capacity as a company, Moderna, to 1 billion. not a million, not 10 million or whatever, so if you go to 1 billion and Fauci's involved and they're mobilizing January 13th for this COVID so-called vaccine, how does that fit with, as you say, not only telling everyone is not a problem, but every other action going in that same direction, there's not a problem, including behind the scenes, including fighting Trump, including fighting Navarro. You're absolutely right. Something doesn't sit right. Something's not right there.
No, something's not right. And it's worth, you said it, but just to make sure everybody caught that. When Moderna, the CEO of Moderna, when he went, Stefan Bancel, I think is the guy's name.
Right, yeah.
When he went to his head of production, it was in 2019, and told him, be prepared. We're about to make an exponential ramp up. 100,000, as you said, not 1 million. 1 million to 1 billion is gargantuan. But, the exponential growth between 100,000 doses that they've done in that year of mRNA to 1 billion. And that was in 2019. We don't know that precise date, presumably probably in December, sometime late in 2019. But it was absolutely, in his own words, 2019, not 2020. And then you have this strange delay on the public face of it from Fauci that just doesn't add up, especially as he's being fought internally. And those fights would continue. Everybody probably remembers how do you even say it? Hydroxychloroquine and the fight over that and how Trump was ridiculed for promoting that. Well, as it turns out, first of all, we now know with hindsight that hydroxychloroquine actually is effective in fighting COVID, and the NIH even now admits that on their website. But there was an April 4th fight, and it happened on a Saturday, where Peter Navarro was pushing the use of hydroxychloroquine and that Trump should actually maybe consider promoting that. And apparently the fight was so bad it turned into a screaming match between Fauci and Navarro. So what happens? At the next press conference, Trump actually on Sunday brings up hydroxychloroquine for the first time. And that's when everybody, all the media, got their panties in a bunch and how insane is this, etc. Again, bearing in mind that now the NIH says it actually is effective. Well, what happened? Saturday was the fight. Sunday, Trump goes out and promotes the use of hydroxychloroquine. On Monday, all of Peter Navarro's memos were suddenly leaked to the media. And they were leaked in a manner that made it look like not that Fauci and Navarro were fighting, but rather that Trump was ignoring Navarro's warnings. So the way it was leaked to the media was that Navarro was sending these warnings out, and Trump, as being a bad president, ignored them. As it turns out, Trump had never even seen the emails. They got held up at the National Security Council, which is another story into itself. But that leak happened. But there was another event as well. All of a sudden, the Department of Health and Human Services, the same department that just testified they didn't testify yesterday. They were there, but they refused to answer questions. The same department that defended the NIH's deletion of the sequence issued a report condemning the Trump administration for backlogs and problems at hospitals and healthcare workers, that the supply chain was a mess, which, as far as we know, it really wasn't. Who had just been put in charge of the supply chain issues? Peter Navarro. So again, bear in mind, big fight on Saturday, and all of a sudden, two separate things happen on Monday that basically sideline Navarro and try to discredit him. We don't know who the sources of those leaks are. I know what my opinions as to who the source is. You can draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, hydroxychloroquine wasn't the only one. I mean, there was the other one that's now been confirmed is this the lighting, the lighting that kills the virus.
UV.
Which, okay, I mean, Trump kind of garbled his words a little bit when he talked about it, but it was obvious that he wasn't. They made it out as if he was saying you should take a bottle of chlorine or whatever, pour it down your throat. Of course, he didn't say that. He was talking about light, and that's very clear. Only that he then, in his inimitable way, goes on and garbles his words and mumbles on about stuff. And then I guess it was easy for the media to turn that around. But just on its own, I don't think they would have done much with it had they not gotten a prompt to go after Trump. And all it would take, again, I don't know this, is for someone like Fauci to pull aside a couple of New York Times people or Washington Post or whatever and say, hey, by the way, this whole thing about the light, that's not true, or that's ridiculous, or whatever. And there was a huge pile-on after that. And guess what? Now it's been confirmed that this stuff actually kills the virus. And of course, ivermectin as well. So the idea that there was this immense pushback against anything at all that might help is in itself suspicious. And of course that ties in.
It's really, that is the point, is that we have 3 different treatments that were promoted by Trump that now have all proven to be effective to some degree. When I had COVID, I took ivermectin and I was over it in a snap. It was, who knows? Maybe that was just psychosomatic. Maybe it was coincidental, but whatever. But the point is, there was 3 different potential treatments for COVID that were dirt cheap, inexpensive. Fauci fought like crazy against every one of them, discredited every one of them, made sure that the media then discredited all those treatments. Meanwhile, what was Fauci doing? He was promoting the use of the mRNA vaccines, which he'd always wanted to do, after a seeming initial delay, which allowed the coronavirus to spread. Not only did they delete the sequence, Fauci was against closing down air flights. So he had all this early action that, if you're looking at it objectively, you would say, what does that do? Well, it seems like that would help to spread the coronavirus. Then you have these cheap alternative treatments that don't require Pfizer, don't require Moderna, whatever. He worked as hard as he could to discredit those, and we now know that they're actually effective.
And of course, just as a reminder, to anyone who doesn't know, the reason why you have to stop any alternative treatments is if they exist, even just a little bit. You cannot have these emergency use authorizations for a new drug altogether. So you can't have these mRNAs, again, hyper speed, no testing or no proper testing, no long-term, no nothing, completely new technology. You can't just unleash that without an emergency use authorization, and you cannot get such an authorization if there is an alternative. So that was an all hands on deck effort by Fauci and his people to make sure there was no alternative.
Yeah, and now we shift a little bit because, Trump had been kind of building up to a lab leak, to publicly stating it. And the first time I found where he was he hinted really strongly on it was April 15th. So we're just moving forward a couple of weeks in the timeline here. And Trump was at a press conference and he was asked by John Roberts, and although he didn't come right out and say it was a lab leak yet, he would do so shortly, that he thought he'd seen. He hinted at it very strongly. And it's interesting what happened right after that, because it appears you got immediate comments from his military. Mark Esper, the very next day, came out and said that, well, that's awfully inconclusive, but we still believe it to be a natural origin. Trump then holds another press conference on the 17th. And he once again seems to intimate that he thinks that it was indeed a lab leak. I'm looking to see if I can find his actual quote here. But it's on April 17th that after Trump says that he believes it was a lab leak, Fauci suddenly steps up to the podium and says, no, we as the medical side of things, the scientific side of things, we believe it's a natural origin. And the reason we believe it is a natural origin is because we've got this paper, Proximal Origin, that was written by these fantastic scientists. I can't remember their names, but let me get the paper out to the media. So you kind of saw this elevation of the lab leak. And right as Trump was beginning to get to a definitive statement, Fauci comes crashing in. And what happened? Trump is immediately discredited. Trump is claiming there's a lab leak without evidence. Even his own military officials say there's no evidence. Meanwhile, Fauci, representing the scientific community, is proving that it was a natural origin. So there was this punch-counterpunch that was going on against any talk of a lab leak. And I'll let you jump in, but it gets even worse.
Well, just as a quick kind of digression here, just it's worth noting that one of the narratives from the natural origin hoaxer crowd is that you had to push natural origin because of Trump, because to counter Trump, because Trump was seeding this horrible idea of a bioweapon lab leak, whatever. And as you just said, that's absolutely not true. The first time ever that he ever mentioned anything about it was April 15th. Which was 2.5 months after Fauci's secret teleconference. It was months after people put out papers on lab leaks, which were all suppressed, by the way. So all these efforts of suppression had nothing to do with Trump.
Yep, exactly so. So now, if we step forward a little bit here, remember we had talked about the FBI was investigating things. And the other thing that was going on is in April, there was a State Department email that was done internally. It wasn't done publicly. And the State Department email was very strongly worded. It said that out of the 5 possibilities for a lab leak, we far and away believe that, or the 5 possibilities for the origin of COVID, we strongly believe that a lab leak is the most likely possibility. They even went so far as to say that we think that the other theories were introduced to discredit a lab leak. Literally use those words. Now, that wouldn't have meant much if that hadn't ever gotten out. But on April 28th, suddenly it was reported by the Washington Times. A guy named Bill Gertz got his hands on the document, and he wrote about it. Well, what happened next? The intelligence community suddenly sprang into action. And out of nowhere, they drafted a statement that said something to the effect of that COVID was not genetically modified, COVID wasn't man-made. And they issued that 2 days later on the 30th. Came out of Rick Grinnell's, the acting DNI director. It came out of his office. And, I talked about the fact that it seemed like Trump was building up to definitively saying it was a lab leak. Bear in mind, he hasn't definitively said it's a lab leak yet. Each press conference, he's hit in more strongly. So it appears, well, it doesn't appear, we can tell, Trump was never informed by his own DNI that this statement from the intelligence community was going to come out. He had a press conference on the night of April 30th, and it was the first time that he actually indicated, he said that he'd seen evidence from the intelligence community that was a lab leak. As he was saying that, the reporters say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? We're looking at a real-time report from your own director of national intelligence that's countermanding you, that's saying you're wrong, that you don't know what you're talking about. It literally came out before Trump started the press conference. Nobody told Trump about it. All the reporters had this new intelligence community statement, and they absolutely leg swept Trump on the whole lab origin. It was so bad. It was, what literally real time. What are you talking about? Your own director of national intelligence says that's wrong, the guy that you appointed. And it basically destroyed any viability of talking about a lab leak for the next year. And the natural origin was fully set. And it seems like it was the moment, Hans, that Fauci was really waiting for. Once again, he took action right after this. he did an interview with National Geographic right after this, on like May 1st. I think it didn't get published until maybe May 4th, but he did this huge splashy interview with them in which he basically denied. He said that there was no possibility of a lab leak. It was 100% natural origin. He went so far as to preemptively take out any possibility of a natural virus being housed at the Wuhan lab and then leaking. He said that scientific evidence proves that was impossible too. So, that's all part of this punch counterpunch thing that we've been trying to lay out, that every time Trump would take an action, Fauci would come back and counterpunch, and he'd do it with the help of the intelligence community and a complicit media.
Yeah, I think the picture that's emerging kind of overall is that Fauci was clued into a lot more than he let on.
Yes.
But these immediate actions, when he really kind of steps up and does something, tend to be triggered by something. So those are like the teleconference, the 4-year anniversary today. That was triggered by the Science article, or as you say, this immediate pushback at the White House podium for natural origin followed Trump saying that it might have come out of a lab, or that, as you said, Trump got progressively stronger in his wording.
Right.
But it started on the 15th, and Fauci immediately had to go in there and kind of, clean up, or whatever the word is. So that
April 30th press conference, Hans, it seemed like people knew in advance what Trump was going to say. That, oh crap, he's reached the point where he's finally going to say he's seen evidence, the way that intelligence community countermanded him in real time.
Right. And isn't it funny how when Fauci did his thing on April 17th, when he stood right next to Trump and lied to the media, no, this is totally natural. And he came up with this, these biologists virologists whose names he doesn't know. As you mentioned, he knows them. One of them was sat in his office a few weeks earlier. Another one was a guy, Lipkin, that, we just got emails where he's emailing with this guy like, hey, Ian, congratulations on your award, and this and that, right? And then he pretends, I have no idea who these people are. I can't remember, but they found, and this is the big lie. I mean, other than the natural origin lie in general, is a very specific lie as well, because he says that the virus, as it evolved and it changed, and then it led up to this. Well, the truth is the exact opposite. The thing about this virus is that it did not evolve. It came out perfect to infect humans. There isn't, we can't see kind of a progression of, it becomes a bit more attuned to humans, and like with the original SARS virus, that took months. Well, we don't see that. It came out, boom, and as Deborah Birx belatedly admitted, ready to infect out of the box.
Right.
So I think the overall picture is Fauci knows all this stuff. He knows a lot more than he lets on, and in a lot more detail, as for instance shown by the virus deletion, by the Moderna thing where they mobilize, and various other things we talked about. But he's called into action. He's more kind of reflexive that way. Oh, now I need to do something very specific immediately, and then he keeps doing that. By the way, I think we should say one more thing on this, the deleted virus, another indication of Fauci being really into the weeds and really entangled in all these cover-ups and everything, personally entangled, not some guy, not like at the top who like, the underlings did something wrong, Fauci personally. When Jesse Bloom found evidence of this deleted sequence, which the Chinese guy had uploaded, which we talked about earlier, and Jesse Bloom found evidence of that in some archive somewhere, just like it had been archived by Google or, whatever. I was like, oh, that's strange. That looks like the COVID sequence. Oh, but why did they have it so early? What we talked about.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't know Jesse Bloom personally or whatever, but he seems like a nice guy, but he also seems like a very trusting guy. So he's a very senior person in these fields. So he contacted Fauci and Collins directly because he knew them. He's like, hey guys, I wanted you to know about this. And what did they do? It was a Sunday, and they immediately convened to figure out how to cover it up. on a Sunday. We can see that from the emails. So, and we're talking about Collins and Fauci personally, not some underlings, not whatever. They personally get together on a Sunday to deal with it. So extremely involved and trying to, play the choir boy.
Yeah, and I mean, again, what they tried to later pretend using the Department of Health and Human Services that this was NIH policy to just delete it, yet they were in a tizzy trying to cover it up. I guess I would just try to leave people, I would encourage you just to think about Fauci's actions in the early days. We know that NIH deleted a sequence that would have led to an early vaccine. They only published the sequence when they were forced to because there was another leak that they couldn't contain. They then tried to take credit for the fact that they were the ones doing it, which is horseshit to begin with. A little echo chamber. And then if you look at all of Fauci's actions, in the early days of the coronavirus, if you're looking at them objectively, it's hard to say that they weren't. Well, let's put it this way. If you had taken his advice, don't wear masks, don't worry about COVID, worry about the flu if you want to worry about anything, that would allow the spread of the virus. Then Fauci pushed back against any sort of treatment for COVID, that was an alternative to the mRNA vaccine, and that frankly would have, as you rightly mentioned, would have even invalidated the protections that went around the use of the mRNA vaccine. And then he fought as hard as he possibly could against any discovery of a lab leak. So both of us have always felt that this guy was just a terrible person. But when putting together this timeline and looking at these events much more closely and seeing how interrelated they are, I'm pretty jaded, and yet I was still astonished at seeing just how duplicitous he really was.
Yeah, on the front of him being a terrible person, I think we both knew that in respect of the lab leak and the cover up.
Yeah,
and mainly or probably because he wanted to cover up his own involvement. Other aspects as well, protecting China and so on. There's a bunch of incentives, a bunch of reasons going on there. But the fact that he did that he covered it up and endlessly lied about that, we've known that for a long time, and we've concluded for a long time, that he's a terrible person. Mm-hmm. But I think on the other side, which is to let the virus kind of spread, that's still something that's kind of sinking in. I mean, I think the assumption had been that in terms of his early advice, that he's just incompetent with respect to those things, that he just didn't know what he was talking about. He said nothing to worry about, or that, he didn't know what he was doing. That seems to have been the sort of the general view on that. And I think you raise a really important and, interesting prospect here, that maybe he wasn't quite so innocent. Again, we're not talking lab leak here. We're just talking about his advice to just
the response
the whole
to
thing.
The virus itself.
That may be tying in with his basically lifelong drive to get these universal vaccines out, and suddenly there's this mRNA technology, which, by the way, was only made possible. It's been around for some decades, but it was only made possible in terms of delivery into the human body in 2018. And from that moment onwards, Fauci was kind of itching to get it into those human bodies. So the idea that he may have wanted this to spread around in order to get out his mRNA is, I don't know if that's true, but there's certainly some evidence for that.
As I was putting together this timeline, which is now about 25 pages long, and so I'm a little bit ahead of you, but I had the same reaction, was like, oh my God, if I just stop and look at this objectively and look at these actions, I have a very difficult time juxtaposing his public stance with what he was doing with Moderna behind the scenes in terms of this immense ramp up for a vaccine, as he was publicly telling people that there's nothing to worry about, as he fought against Peter Navarro in real time saying, hey, we need to shut down all flights into the US. Fauci advocated for the opposite of that. And then overlay that with the fact that Fauci seemed to fight against any other alternative treatment that potentially could have invalidated the use of the mRNA vaccines. Fought against every one of those treatments and ridiculed them and dismissed them, got the media to do the same, and we now all those treatments, have some viability, and even the NIH has been forced to acknowledge it. So it left me really disturbed and raised a whole new set of questions.
And also the cover up of this virus's sequence.
Jesse Bloom had a very innocent response to that. He sort of accepted the Health and Human Services explanation, which was no explanation, and said, well, maybe they were supposed to do that. This is in the early days of COVID. If there's a COVID sequence, he knew right what it was when he saw it. Fauci, the people at NIH knew exactly what it was. Instead, they deleted it. I can't get past that.
Yeah, and the expectation would have been, hadn't they suppressed it, and hadn't they suppressed it so meticulously, that's the other, and viciously in terms of the just coercing people and so on, who might have said something about it. The expectation, just an objective expectation, would have been, you get the sequence, you immediately see that there's something very anomalous here. We've all seen those photos of a normal sequence of a coronavirus, and then the one where there's this insert of these 12 nucleotides, the furin cleavage site. It just stands out like a sore thumb. It's right there. I mean, normally there's nothing there, and suddenly, boom, where every other virus has nothing, it has these 12 nucleotides. It's just so obvious. That, I mean, even a non-biologist like myself would have can see, okay, that's a problem. And people did point it out at the time. Yep. Now, from there, it's not a big leap to, well, what is this thing, the 12 nuclear? Oh, that's a furin cleavage site. Oh, weren't there studies in 2018 and 17 and so on about how this furin cleavage site makes viruses much more virulent in humans? Oh, yeah, there were. So then immediately you have a situation where this could be a really, really bad virus, because just not even talking about lab for a moment, just the fact that it's got this thing. So the expectation would have been, if this had been released late December of 2019, and if it had been allowed to be discussed openly, that, and I'm not talking anyone would have realized, I couldn't have realized that just by reading it, but there are people out there who understand this stuff, and some of them piped up, but they were immediately shut up. There were papers very, very early that were put out pointing out that this is a big, big problem, but that was suppressed. So anyway, the expectation would have been, you let this sequence come out, people are going to realize that it's got a furin cleavage site. This is what makes it more virulent. This is going to be a very bad virus. And then, of course, you have all the countermeasures and so on. You can't just say, oh, nothing, ignore it until, whenever. So to add that as an explanation as to why it might have been suppressed.
Exactly. Now, and to kind of give people an understanding, because December 28th to January 12th doesn't sound like that long. But bear in mind that this virus was exponentially growing. Like, that actually is a huge amount of time. And all four Fauci scientists, Michael Farzan, Robert Gary, Christian Anderson, all of these guys, Eddie Holmes, all of them immediately recognized the furin cleavage site and knew that it was highly virulent. If that information had been made public back on December 28th, not just the US's response, but the world's response to the virus could have been very different. Everything was delayed at the most crucial of times.
I think China would have been shut down immediately. By the way, I also think if it had been revealed that this came out of a lab, it would have been like really, really totally shut down. I'm not convinced it would have changed the trajectory, just because this thing was designed to infect humans, which it then did like crazy.
I'm not trying to say, but we would have dramatically altered our response to it.
Sure, but I just think in the long run, everyone would have gotten it anyway, just because of how this thing is designed. But there was another very good reason for having a delay. And of course, the fact that the delay was ended on January, 11th or 12th, was because a Chinese guy leaked it. The delay could have gone on for longer. Eventually, it would have come out. But anyway, there's another advantage of having that delay, which is you can prepare to your natural origin narrative. Remember, Peter Daszak was out there on, early January, writing his long thread about why this thing must be natural, before anyone was even talking about a lab. There's other instances as well of narrative shaping taking place in those early days. So I think that's another
For people
bonus
who
of
don't
doing
know,
it this way.
Daszak literally sent Fauci like this set of talking points. Like, in case you happen to get asked by the media, here's why it's a natural origin kind of discussion.
Yeah,
And then
he
wrote
did
all
do
the
that.
points for Fauci. It's unbelievable.
So hiding that, again, we don't know. Maybe Jesse Bloom was right. Maybe it was just some kind of oversight or whatever. But it's extremely suspicious that it happened. And now we're just talking about hiding the sequence. And of course, the fact that Fauci personally on a Sunday had to convene an emergency conference in terms of how to cover up of the sequence.
Coupled with the fact that we know that China was quite literally asking Eddie Holmes to hold the virus sequence and not release it publicly.
Which he was more than happy to comply with.
Which he was more than happy to do.
Is just unbelievable.
And
As
he
you say,
happens
every
to be
day
tight with
counts.
Fauci.
And he was like, oh, well, China doesn't want us to do that, so let's not do that. And then later on, he claims the credit and claims awards for it.
So anyway, we're going to keep doing more work on this, but this going back and looking much harder at the first 4 months was really an eye-opening exercise, and frankly was disturbing, because I think it does raise, well, not I think, it raises a whole host of new questions. We may never get answers to those, but certainly you can draw your own inferences from what we've laid out.
Very much so.